No, I'm going to do something strange. And when I say something, it's because there is a hint of Jamaican in my language. But I wanted to start out this evening as a preface to the presentations that are happening, to open with an invitation or a recall to the ancestors that we are here today to think about, to commemorate, to think with. And forgive my croaky voice, because I'm not so good with singing, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I want to do this particular song because it is about struggle. In the Jamaican cosmos space of ritual, thinking about the colonial past in the present, there's a particular group of practices that are from the African aquifer, we could say, that inform a lot of the Afro-Jamaican practices that happen in the present. And there's this one song that they sing very often to speak to struggle. They say, I cannot bear it out no longer. I cannot bear it out, dear Savior. I ask me Savior to be me helper. And then they do it in a certain joy, because it can't be a straight song, they say. And I ask me Jesus to be my guide. They say, I can't bear it out any longer. I need help. And then they say, let's get ready. Let's all get ready for a particular future that we're going to create. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wayne Modest. And I, together with my colleague right there, Marika from Bommel, together we formed the directee of this complicated institute, this wonderful institution, the Tropenmuseum. An institution that has, over the past few years, past decade, one could say even longer, been struggling with how do you deal with an institution that was so or is so fundamentally entangled with the colonial past. That in every single frieze of the building, and I keep saying if I invite you to my office and you open the door, even the door lock is colonial. How do we contend with the afterlives of that colonial past in the present? How do we deal with the edifice that remains as such a massive edifice in the city of Amsterdam, but also in the Netherlands, of a past that we in our framework have described as a kind of troubling, terrible inheritance? What does it mean to inherit the structures, the ways of thinking, the archives? And what responsibility does that give to us as we try to think about the present and try to structure different kinds of future? The Tropenmuseum forms part of an even more entangled history, a history of ethnography and ethnographic museums, institutions that at their core were part of a divided world, a world over there, a world far away, where the people we studied were not regarded as equals. They were regarded as part of a progressive taxonomy, a hierarchy of the human that we could study to understand what our humanity looks like. How do we deal with these objects as afterlives? Today, we're going to talk a little bit and hear from an eminent scholar about thinking about what public history looks like, how to think about history's afterlives. But also, what are our responsibilities in that? We're going to an eminent scholar who has not only spent time in the halls of academia, but who has been contending with what it might mean to tell a story, even competitively, with the many forms of media that tell the story of the colonial past, but also what it might mean to break through the silence that we've come comfortable with. We are very, very, very pleased to do this together with the NINSE, a partner that we've been working with for quite a while now. And I must tell you, my most favorite collaboration with the NINSE was last week Friday in this room when we had the children's Keti. And right here in this hall were about 300 young people, little ones. And I must tell you, it was an uncomfortable conversation because their questions were so sharp. At one moment, I must admit, because the opening was done by the Burgemeester, the mayor, and at one moment I was worried for her. Can she answer this one? So I hope, if anything else, while we welcome you today, you will be as generous an audience, as critical an audience. We've already whispered to David, I'm whispering now, that you will come with questions as we constitute together what the future might look like. And that is the kind of joy that we're going to have. And it will be a difficult one as well. We are not expecting questions so that we can be happy. We're expecting questions that we can deal with the complexity of how the colonial past rests with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to this edifice, but with an edifice that is struggling, and enjoy the struggle as we try to fashion a different kind of future, knowing that we inhabit a world that colonialism made. So I invite you to be a part of our ongoing conversations today and after. But for today, I invite you to help me welcome our first person to the podium, Erwin, who is the director of NINSE.
Thank you. Thank you. Listen to your story, Wayne. I find out that I'm an agent. Yes, I'm an agent, and I'm proud of that, especially because I'm a descendant of a formal plantation in Para, in Suriname. And yeah, I'm proud of that. Good evening, goedemiddag, of goedenavond. Good evening, welcome. Minister Dijkgraaf visit also the plantation where I come from last week, I think. Welcome to the annual lecture, Koti lecture that held by NINSE as part of the national commemoration years of 150, 160 years of the abolition of the Dutch transatlantic slavery. When Afro-Caribbean people came to the Netherlands, one of the many strange things we found here was a version of Dutch history that was in fact totally unrecognizable to us. Now, it is common knowledge in the Caribbean region that practically everything about our present social, cultural, and political life is determined by a past of slavery and colonialism. But the past of slavery and colonialism in the Caribbean were hardly an issue in the Netherlands. Not until we made it an issue, that is. This came about when we found out that whatever the Dutch people had forgotten about their colonial past, it was not how to exclude and underestimate people with African roots. This convinced us that it was necessary to refresh the Dutch collective memory towards a more comprehensive understanding of their past in order to fully involve our fellow Dutch people in our struggle to achieve justice and equal citizenship. So, from the beginning, activism against racism and discrimination went hand in hand with unsilencing what happened to our ancestors, those who were enslaved. And in successfully doing so, we found an important way to establishing some agency in a society where we often felt overpowered, outnumbered, and ignored. Now, in this activist phase, highlighting the victimhood of our ancestor was employed as a major rhetoric device to call for attention and to impress white people. It is also served to remind ourselves of our sacred and urgent duty to honor our ancestors and to make sure their suffering would not be colossally forgotten. But there is no denying that highlighting victimhood has its drawbacks. By exclusively portraying our ancestors as just victims, we did not do justice to their fully humanity, to their achievements, their agency. We must also be careful not to give a depressing image to our ancestors, of our ancestors to our own children. To overcome this limitation, Nancy now been working on a shift in the focus in our dealings with the past towards what we have called the strength of our ancestors. The strength of our ancestors was that against all oppression, they engaged in permanent and successful struggle for improvement of their situation, liberation, and emancipation. And moreover, they were culturally, intellectually, musically active and enterprising people. In spite of all the cruelties they had to endure, they enjoyed themselves whenever they could. And they had meaningful relationships of all sorts. Also, they were critically analyzing what was happening around them and established a strong educational repertoire to prepare their children to deal with hardship and oppression. Now, the point I really want to make is that it is crucial to connect this renewed awareness of our ancestors' agency with our understanding of the long-term effects of slavery in our communities, or what we call, with a useful, ambiguous Dutch word, doorwerkingen. This is really urgent. Now the subject of doorwerkingen is rapidly gaining priority on the agenda of the national efforts to come to terms with the past of slavery. An uncomfortable truth is that discussion on doorwerkingen have traditionally been stuck within a tiresome frame that, simply put, is as follows. Many of our present day's problems are due to defects in our culture that are doorwerkingen of slavery and colonial times, so caused by the planters. This frame of inherited victimhood is not only simplistic and fatalistic, it is also fundamentally false and misguided. It is time to see the cultural patterns subsumed under doorwerkingen not as things we have been stamped with, but as the result of struggle of our ancestors. We have to realize that when we talk about doorwerkingen, it always concerns cultural patterns originating in actions that were undertaken by our ancestors to ensure a better life for themselves and their children and grandchildren. Now, that does not make those cultural patterns perfect or final or secret, but it is extremely unwise to blame those patterns for any deprivation we experience today. Whatever the problematic aspects of our culture, there is no reason to believe they are fundamentally more problematic than everybody else's culture. What we have inherited in terms of problems are persistent poverty, systemic racism, and subordination, not a fundamentally defective culture. The way to make our reflection on doorwerking produce is to trace the agency of our ancestors, as like Wayne did, and in one and the same move to define ourselves as agents in their footsteps too. We have to act in the spirit of our ancestors and see ourselves as actors in a long chain of actors that have produced our culture hitherto. It is precisely from this strength that inspiration must be drawn to connect with all allies and to process the negative effects of the past in a beneficial way. The Nancy not only wants to harvest in this improving climate, but also wants to bring about a certain turn. It is up to us to reproduce what is valuable to reproduce, to overcome what has to be overcome, to improve what has to be improved, to develop what has to be developed. And I think this view will enable us to effectively flesh out the process behind the comma, het proces achter de comma. Thank you.
For those who speak English, I must admit I can't know how to translate doorwerking, because it kind of is impact, but not really. It just doesn't work out. So I'll ask a few people around, and then we might come to that. Afterlives, the afterlives. Now, in thinking about this time to commemorate, in thinking about 150 years or 160 years, because David, for you to know, it is the same in the British system with a certain kind of apprenticeship. Then it was self-evident who we could invite to speak. It was self-evident because to think about 101 or 150, we also wanted to think about what it might mean to think it comparatively. That it is not just a Dutch question, but it is a broader question. It is a question about colonialism. But we were also interested in thinking about a scholar who has been committed to the excavation, to trying to push against the silence. A scholar whose work, as I said before, has gained him some fame because of the stubborn persistence. And I actually wanted to cite Erwin here, because even if David would not describe himself as an activist, I don't use activist as fighting on the chains. I use fighting activist as somebody who is stubbornly insistent that things can be different. He has been somebody like that, wanting to make change. A professor of public history, someone who has written extensively, multi-award winning BBC series about the forgotten slave owners. This is somebody whose work has gone not only in the big histories, but also questions of what it might mean to live in houses, the house of history. somebody who is committed to seeing history as a part of restorative justice. It was therefore essential that we have somebody like David Olusoga as our keynote, as our thinker today, to lead us through that conversation around silences and unsilence. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to make it loud, as we can do in the Netherlands, as we invite David to the podium to help us think through how we might think commemoration after 150 or 160 years. And perhaps he will even have something to say, and I'll explain to David later on about this comma that everybody is talking about what happens after the comma. Welcome.
Wayne, thank you very much for that kind introduction. One moment. I think the idea is that I'll speak for about 40 minutes, then we have time for questions towards the end. But I want to begin by saying it is a genuine honor to be here. It's a privilege to be asked to present the Koti lecture of 2023. I'd like to thank the organizers, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending either here in the Tropen or virtually. And it's a particular honor to be here in the Netherlands to discuss these issues around slavery and empire at this moment, a few days before the start of the Slavery Memorial Year, marking 150, 160 years, we can get into that debate, since the abolition of slavery. Of course, manumission and abolition are not the same thing. And this lecture, as you will know, is just one event in a whole calendar of upcoming gatherings, lectures, exhibitions, unveilings, concerts, ceremonies taking place across the Netherlands. And it is thrilling to be able to discuss these issues at this moment, in this decade, the 2020s, a decade in which I would argue the fruits of previous decades of research are now coming to light and being published. That once secret contents of archives here in this country and elsewhere are being uncovered, analyzed by scholars, revealed to the public in great detail and becoming public history. The work I do as a public historian is as a connective circuit between public discourse and the world of scholarship. The work I do is about linking scholarship to public discourse. Without one, there is no other. That research has been part of this moment that we are living through, of acknowledgement, of recognition, of tentative moves, often incomplete moves towards restorative justice for histories of the slave trade and enslavement and empire across the world. And at the same time, that research has, of course, been the great engine of knowledge production that has made this moment possible. This moment rests on the work of scholars, but also of activists, of local historians, of communities, here and across the New World. This is a lecture not about slavery and the slave trade themselves, but about the legacies they have left within our societies, and how many of those legacies were systematically, often ingeniously, disguised and concealed, and why and how that it is now in the 21st century that this act of erasure is beginning to fall apart. Because we are seeing today is something which is nothing less than an age of reckoning about aspects of history that have been entombed behind decades of silence and often disinformation and disavowal. The breaking of that silence can be seen in my home nation of Britain, where research a few years ago into the compensation, £20 million sterling, given at the end of slavery. That research carried out by the Legacies of Slave Ownership project at University College London set in train an ongoing debate about where the profits from slavery and the slave trade ended up, the role of the state, the role of the royal family, the role of thousands of British companies, corporations, and institutions in the slave trade, in enslavement, and how those profits, how the financial DNA from those activities lives on in the 21st century. That project and others has forced numerous companies, institutions, universities, and even private families, dynasties with connections to slavery, to begin a process of acknowledgement, of research, and at times of restitution. Last year, King Charles, when he was then still the Prince of Wales, said this when speaking to the Commonwealth heads of government reception in Rwanda. The King said, "I cannot describe the depths of my personal sorrow at the suffering of so many as I continue to deepen my own understanding of slavery's enduring impact." Further research into the role of the British royal family in establishing the royal charter companies that expanded the slave trade and its profits from 1660 onwards is currently being undertaken. And of course, the histories of the Netherlands and those of the United Kingdom overlap. It is striking that, to my knowledge, there has been almost no media coverage in the United Kingdom beyond a report in the Guardian newspaper that I'm proud to write for on the publication here in the Netherlands of State and Slavery. That is all the more surprising given that Willem III, the Dutch stadtholder, was, as you will know, also William III of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. The silence is deafening. Similarly, in Germany, back in 2021, the Berlin government went further than it ever has before in acknowledging the full scale and genocidal horror of what took place in its former colony in southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, at the dawn of the 20th century. That genocide that involved the use of concentration camps and at least one facility better understood as an extermination camp. That genocide that ended with slavery. The subject of my first book, co-written with the Danish historian Casper Eriksson. That genocide is being confronted, recognized, discussed, debated. It is the subject of exhibitions and new books in a way that has never been the case up until now. In a process that was groundbreaking, if deeply flawed, the German government in 2021 proposed a payment of 1 billion euros to Namibia in recognition for that crime. And last December, as you all know, your own Prime Minister issued a statement on behalf of the Dutch government apologizing for the past actions of the Dutch state to the enslaved people in the past, everywhere in the world. The volume of discussion on slavery here and elsewhere is very much needed. The Netherlands is one of the few nations in which public attitudes towards empire can be more idealized than in my home, the United Kingdom. An attitudinal survey carried out by the British polling company YouGov in 2022 into how much pride or shame people from various nations feel about their historic empires discovered that 32% of people in the United Kingdom regarded the British Empire as something to be more proud of than ashamed. That number in the Netherlands was 50%, while 19% of people in Britain, 23% of Belgians, 20% of Germans and Japanese regard their former empires as something to be ashamed of. In that survey, only 6% of the citizens of the Netherlands felt the same way about the Dutch colonial empire. The urge to cling to a version of imperial history that presents imperialism as a vast act of charity, carried out in the name of civilization for the betterment rather than the extractive exploitation of others, is today under uncontrollable pressure, here and in other nations. Histories once denied are being confronted, rarely fully or wholeheartedly. The process of acknowledgement, and even more so any attempts to engage with the idea of restorative justice, is almost always flawed and staggering. And the fundamental imperative to work hand in hand with descended communities is often learnt too late, after the fact. Yet, for all of these flaws and missteps, something remarkable is happening. Where we are today, the conversations that are happening, the apologies that are being made, the research carried out, the books, papers and studies being published, and increasingly the commitments made to forms of restorative justice by states, but also by institutions, and I will come on to that later, were not predicted because they were not predictable just a few years ago. I happened to live in one of the cities that for a moment in the summer of 2020 was at the epicenter of this age of reckoning. In some parts of the world, Bristol is better known as a brand of cigarettes than as an ancient English city. Yet perhaps now, after 2020, that city has at least a globally recognized image. That image is of the statue of a slave trader being toppled into the city's river. The statue, now recovered in a storage facility in a museum, was of the slave trader Edward Colston, a man who died 299 years before his statue was toppled. His name was well known among the financial elites of London and Bristol during his lifetime. His name is far more known, far more famous today than it was at any time in his lifetime, but for reasons he could not have possibly imagined or foreseen. The son of a wealthy merchant, Edward Colston built his career in London but remained politically and institutionally connected to Bristol, the city of his birth. He ultimately became the city's MP, and after his death, he became primarily remembered neither as a slave trader nor as a member of parliament, but as a philanthropist. In his lifetime, he founded 2 almshouses for former sailors, a hospital, a religious school for boys. He endowed other institutions. His philanthropic donations to the city have been estimated to be around £71,000, several million in today's money. However, much, although not all, of that wealth lavished upon Bristol was derived from his involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Edward Colston became a critical figure in the Royal African Company, the most prolific slave trading entity in British history, and was appointed an assistant, one of 24 leading shareholders, whose responsibilities roughly equated to those of company executives today. A shareholder from 1680, from 1692, he became deputy governor 1689 to 1690, a position roughly equating to CEO today. His investments in the Royal African Company are the equivalent of millions today, and he drew 7 dividends in his time with the company and supplied it with loans. It was in this capacity, as a leading figure within the English Royal African Company, that Edward Colston, as new research by the historian Brooke Newman has demonstrated, awarded £1,000 worth of company stock to William III, our shared monarch, in the year 1689. This money was awarded to the king, to the stadtholder, to help him, encourage him to support the company's activities and defend its royal charter. William, on receipt of this stock, agreed to serve as governor to the Royal African Company and act with kindness towards it. Both William and his wife, Queen Mary, were paid dividends on their holdings, and they bought further shares in the company. And some of the funds received by King William from the Royal Africa Company were used to build Kensington Palace, the residence today of Britain's future king, another William. The statue of Colston that was toppled in 2020 and that has become the iconic image of my city in the 21st century and part of current global conversations and debates about slavery, empire, restorative justice, has less to do with his life in the 17th century than it does to the distortion of history that took place in the 19th century. It was in the late 19th century that a series of charities established around Colston and his memory and his philanthropy created a calendar of veneration towards the former slave trader. And yet, this calendar of veneration was utterly silent about his role in the transatlantic slave trade. A Victorian cult of Colston portrayed him as a saintly philanthropist, airbrushing out the human beings who were the raw commodity he traded. This image of Colston was reinforced in print and from the pulpit. The city cathedral and various churches were deeply involved in this cult to a slave trader, particularly on Colston Day in November. And that cult lasted well into the 20th century. In 1931, the Church Times published an article that described one of the most prolific slave traders in our history as Bristol's saint. Until 2020, many people imagined that the statue that stood in the city centre had been erected sometime after his death in 1721. It was actually erected in 1895. The Victorians, merchants involved in the creation of that statue, were unable, when they made that decision, to deify a slave trader. They were incapable of envisaging a future time in which the history of the Atlantic slave trade would be the focus of extensive historical research and forensic financial investigation. Similarly, they failed to envisage an age in which the people of Bristol, the people of Britain, the people of other nations would care about the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. That time arrived in the late 20th century when Bristol, like many cities in Europe, became home to communities who were the descendants of formerly enslaved people. Disquiet about the various memorials, about the cult of the slave trader, particularly the statue, began in the 1970s. And the truth about Bristol's role as a slave trading port became better known. Direct action was taken against that statue in 1998. In 2007, it was daubed in red paint, the color of blood. And in 2018, clay figures were arranged around the plinth in the shape of the famous diagram of the slave ship Brooks, one of the great campaigning tools of the abolitionist movement in Britain. What had happened was that a statue that had been designed to celebrate the life of a man who traded in human beings had been repurposed silently without anyone really noticing. And instead, it had become a lightning rod to which one British city debated and struggled over its legacy and of the nation's legacy of involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. A statue built to deliberately ignore and marginalize one man's involvement became a constant reminder of a whole nation's complicity in chattel slavery. In 2020, when that huge bronze statue toppled from its pedestal and crashed onto the pavement, it was as if what cracked was not merely the paving stones, but a centuries-long practice of denial and concealment. And through the cracks in the paving stone, around that colossal wreck, faster than ever before, those uncomfortable truths, those contested facts that had for centuries been marginalized, burst into our own time. Under unprecedented global media attention, all focused on that one small city, history became headline news. And history remains, 3 years later, headline news. Public history, as a practice, used to be to try to persuade people of the relevance of history. Today, it is to try to be part of a debate which is uncontrollable, because the breaking down of barriers between history and now, between cause and effect, between slavery and racism, that is a feature of our moment. Bristol's role in the Atlantic slave trade began when the Royal African Company, in which both Edward Colston and King William, our shared monarch, were participants, had lost its monopoly. At that moment, Bristol seized the opportunity to enrich itself from the trade in enslaved Africans and the commodities they produced. In the 1690s, Bristol merchants lobbied intensively to prevent the Royal African Company being awarded a new monopoly. And within a decade of the end of that monopoly, Bristol merchants were operating around 60 slaving vessels. Between 1698 and the prohibition of the British slave trade in 1807, 2,114 known slave trading expeditions left from Bristol. Around 20% of all the slave trading voyages that left British ports in the entire history of the trade. And between them, they carried into enslavement an estimated 500,000 Africans. And during this period, Bristol became deeply interconnected with trading centers in the Caribbean and North America. That number, carried on the ships of one small English town, is the same as the population of Bristol today. It is only 100,000 fewer than those transported into slavery by the Dutch nation. The scale of that city's involvement cannot, of course, be understood solely through the number of ships that left the city's harbours. The processing of sugar and tobacco, especially important in Bristol, the city's shipyards were involved in constructing slave ships, and companies in and around the city were involved in the production and manufacture of the goods for which enslaved people were traded on the coast of Africa. Much of what is true of my hometown, Bristol, is true of the city we are gathered in today, and of other cities across this continent. And what is true of Edward Colston, a man few of us outside of Bristol had heard of just 3 years ago, is true of literally thousands of similarly forgotten historical figures across Europe and the Americas. All that is different about Colston, all that is different about Bristol, is that in the summer of 2020, in front of cameras and the world's press, a group of young people cast his effigy into that same river from which 2,114 slave ships set sail. And the story of slavery and the slave trade is, of course, just as central to the history of the Netherlands as to the UK. Indeed, there are strong connections between the two states, as I mentioned, not just a shared monarch, but also the English and then the British habit of emulation of Dutch strategies, of Dutch financial structures, After all, it was the Dutch who sold the English sugar processing technology and many of the enslaved Africans used to begin their tentative slave empire in the Caribbean in the early decades of the 17th century. And the Dutch were in a position to assist the British in this endeavor because between the 17th and the 19th centuries, more than 600,000 African people were trafficked by Dutch slave traders. And the wealth from those trades and the wealth drawn from the trade in the commodities, the survivors of the Middle Passage produced, was central to the fundamental to the wealth of this city as it was to Bristol. Peppergin Brandon and Ulbe Bosman have estimated that in 1770, 5.2% of the GDP of the Dutch Republic and 10.36% of the GDP of its richest province, Holland, was based on Atlantic slavery. And also that as much as 40% of all growth of the economy of Holland in the decades around 1770 can be traced in some ways back to slavery. The economic historian Klaus Ronbach of Gothenburg University has calculated similar figures for Great Britain around the same period. In a paper of 2018 that built and expanded upon earlier work and earlier methodologies pioneered by David Eltis and Stanley Engerman and others, Ronbach estimated that by the year 1800, the triangular slave trade was generating 5.7% of the UK's GDP. Looking at entire value chains rather than individual commodities, Ronbach argues that when the wealth derived from plantations in the Caribbean and in North America is added, that GDP figure rises to 7.9%, and that the value of all slave-related industries can be estimated at around 11% of the British economy by the early 19th century. Now, we have those statistics and others like them because over recent decades, nations, institutions, universities, charities, and dynasties have been tentatively gathering information about the historic connections to slavery and the slave trade. Yet this knowledge has often existed almost as a separate arena of history, that no matter how vivid a picture this research painted of the European nations and their involvement in those trades, no matter how detailed and forensic the accountancy of the wealth accrued, the study of New World chattel slavery was always incapable, it seemed, of forcing itself into a wider reassessment of national histories. The history of empire, like what in the UK is called Black history, often seemed to exist in a separate annex or a tributary to the mainstream of history, one that was easily ignored and often explained away. It feels only now, in this decade, the 2020s, that this tributary has begun to flow into the mainstream of history. It is only now that this history of slavery and empire is beginning to be recognized, not marginalized, and seen as fundamental and integral to economies, cultures, and the built environments of many European nations. The reality with which so many people are struggling is that national histories and national mythologies that are used to sustain and reinforce national identities and senses of nationhoods were generations ago systematically stripped of their global, their extractive, their exploitative aspects. In the culture wars of the 21st century, historians are routinely accused of rewriting history. The reality is that our national histories were rewritten, but decades ago, generations earlier, to deliberately exclude and marginalize uncomfortable connections and brutal realities. Because, of course, the Dutch Golden Age is also the age of Dutch chattel slavery. The celebrated age, so-called age of exploration, that remains fundamental to the self-image and national mythology of Spain and even more so Portugal, is also the era in which those nations pioneered the Atlantic slave trade and developed new forms of plantation-based chattel slavery built on cash crops and the commoditization of human beings. The heyday of the British Empire in the 18th and 19th century is the era that spans the height and then the demise of British slavery and later British deep entanglement with American slavery. Cleaned up, repurposed, repackaged, heavily edited and idealized. These are some of the pillars upon which national identities rest and have been built. But those pillars in the 2020s are beginning to crack under the sheer weight of the new evidence, new research projects, new reports, and new demands from descendant communities and from the nations in which enslavement was practiced. Often the emergence of these histories into the public debate creates a sense of frustration that has led and does lead to backlash. Those angered at and threatened by the prospect of reassessing the role of slavery, the slave trade, and empire in their national histories sometimes allow themselves to wallow in a perverse sense of victimhood. Nations, institutions, and individuals accustomed to hearing only glorious stories, heroic narratives, can and do misinterpret the emergence of a fuller, more comprehensive, more inclusive, and more honest version of their national past as an attack on them and their identities. Because, as we know, to be the privileged often confuse equality with oppression. One symptom of this is a demand for closure, a powerful urge to find a way of drawing a line under slavery or empire and quarantining those aspects of history into one historical era. There is often an urge to come up with a convenient end date for slavery and the slave trade, and of course, a focus on abolition rather than enslavement itself. This allows, in terms of our emotional relationship with the past and the identities drawn from it, for a return to normal service, a return to national histories that are celebratory. Slavery or empire are corralled into defined, delineated areas and not allowed to contaminate other epochs. One of the underlying issues here is that the histories of slavery and empire were, until recent decades, so comprehensively buried and concealed that in many cases, what has so far been exhumed and publicly debated and become part of public history represents only a fragment of the story. The sense of persecution or victimhood that is a feature of this moment is accentuated when the sheer scale of this history is, decade by decade, story by story, slave ship by slave ship, revealed, and whole new chapters brought into the debate. Part of the problem is that there is nothing neat or morally simple about that end date that people cling to, abolition. The 700,000 people manumitted from slavery in 1838 in the British Empire, like those later released from formal slavery in the Dutch Empire, were forced to continue to work for no pay, with no rights, for years after the abolition of slavery. Emancipation Day and Keti mark manumission, not emancipation. The enslaved were not, in either empire, miraculously delivered from misery. Rather, they were thrust instantly into a desperate economic predicament. Enslavement was followed by poverty and landlessness, held in place by the exact same racial ideology that had been used to build and then defend the slave system. In the United Kingdom this year, the deep desire for finality, for that end date, among some, and the endless search for a neat conclusion to stories, has led to the emergence of one of those lesser-known chapters. Abolition did not only fail to usher in justice, it also does not automatically equate to a nation disconnecting itself from New World slavery. This year, in the United Kingdom, the Guardian newspaper, originally the Manchester Guardian, and the city of Manchester have been confronting another reality that undermines that search for simple answers and simple end dates, and reveals that while these histories are today better known and better understood, there are more chapters yet to be confronted. We are, after all, nearer the beginning of this long journey to rebuild an inclusive and critical histories of empire and slavery than we are to the end. That longed-for end date in Britain, the date of manumission in 1838, of most but not all enslaved people in the British Empire, is undermined by the reality that for a full half-century after abolition, in its own empire, the British economy remained deeply entwined with chattel slavery. Throughout the 19th century, both before and abolition in the 1830s, British banks and British merchants heavily invested in the slave economy of the United States and of South America. While British businesses imported enormous quantities of raw materials and commodities produced by enslaved people who lived in bondage and beyond the borders of the British Empire, at the same time the nation celebrated its abolition and its role as the centre, the pulpit for anti-slavery elsewhere. And at the centre of that dimly understood history was the commodity cotton and the city, Manchester. Long before abolition, the plantation owners of the British Caribbean had largely moved away from the production of cotton. British cotton processors, the owners of the nation's mills and factories, had begun to import ever-increasing amounts of that critical raw material from the United States, where a vast cotton boom was underway, partly funded by capital that flowed into the United States from the City of London. On the eve of the American Civil War, the inflow of American cotton into Britain was vast. And the 2,500 cotton mills and factories that had emerged in Lancashire in the northwest of England, many of them around the city of Manchester, were where that cotton was processed. And Manchester itself, by the middle decades of the century, had acquired a nickname, Cottonopolis, the city of cotton. It was in that city, in 1821, that 9 men who had grown wealthy in large part from the cotton trade, one of them who was a direct owner of enslaved people, founded Britain's greatest liberal newspaper, the Manchester Guardian. That newspaper, like the city, like institutions across Manchester, are linked to a chapter in the history of slavery that Britain is only just beginning to recognize its complicity and participation in. We are, as I said, nearer the beginning than the end of this journey. 2 years ago, this lecture was given by Sir Hilary Beckles, the formidable chairman of CARICOM, the Reparations Commission. The work of CARICOM is ongoing. Their discussions are live and active, and the histories that they have marshaled to make their case are powerful and in some cases, I would argue, unanswerable. However, since 2020 in particular, in various nations across the world, another parallel process that does not involve states or national authorities has begun. Much of the energy, the commitment towards recognition and reassessment, and the research into the histories of slavery and empire can today be found within private organizations and institutions. Most governments remain fearful of engaging in any process that might lead to calls for restorative justice. However, government inaction increasingly stands in contrast to the activities of many institutions. They are universities, private charities, companies, corporations, and even, as I said earlier, dynasties with long links to slavery. For example, research and forms of restorative justice are being adopted by universities that were either directly or indirectly beneficiaries from slavery. The University Studying Slavery program has expanded, beginning in the United States, and is now burst beyond the borders of that nation. It is, as it describes itself, a consortium of over 90 institutions of higher learning in the United States, Canada, Colombia, Scotland, Ireland, and England, focused on sharing best practices and guiding principles as they engage in truth-telling educational projects focused on human bondage and the legacies of racism in their histories. The actions of these universities, the research that has been carried out, in some cases the projects of restorative justice undertaken, are influenced by the growing movement on campuses in the United States and elsewhere. Demands from young people for institutions to pay reparations and reach out directly in some cases to descendant communities. And this speaks to a far broader reality, that the great driver for wider recognition of history, of slavery, is not just the availability of new research, not just the work of the scholars I mentioned a moment ago. It is also powered by enormous generational attitudinal shifts. It is the young who are demanding a deepening of debates around history. It is young people, as well as of course, people of color themselves, who are demanding the institutions that they study in, the companies that they work for, confront their histories. At the gathering and the events over the coming 12 months here in the Netherlands, the young will, as always, be overrepresented. And when it comes to which organizations are beginning the work of confronting the past, and which organizations have links to historic slavery to confront, there is here a profound irony. The histories of the slave trade and enslavement left behind something that might be called the Colston phenomena. The fact is that many of those men who grew extraordinarily wealthy through slavery and the slave trade, or in the case of the founders of The Guardian, the processing of slave-produced commodities, often committed significant proportions of their wealth to philanthropic endeavors, the endowments of universities, the establishment of charities, schools. As a result, there are, in the 21st century, an astonishing moral and ethical mismatch between the declared aims and cultures of thousands of liberal organizations and their histories. It is, of course, by no means only liberal institutions that have these historical linkages, but it is striking how many organizations that profess progressive and equalitarian values and objectives have histories that are connected to enslavement and the slave trade, that they have in their financial DNA wealth generated through slavery. It is very often those organizations, led by people genuinely disturbed by their institutional histories and financial linkages between modern-day wealth and slavery and the slave trade, that are driving developments in the practice and the study of restorative justice, which is today an infant science, finding its feet, looking for protocols, trying to design best practices, emerging and evolving in different places, in different ways, through engagements with a huge range of institutions. The emergence and the development of restorative justice practice is part of a new moral economy in the 21st century. But it has come about because of a new understanding both of history and also, importantly, of the function of history. National histories built on half-truths, riddled with missing chapters, were in part created in order to bind nations together into what historians have called imagined communities. Yet that deployment of history has demonstrably a corrosive effect upon history itself. If history exists, or if history is deployed in order to create comforting myths and national legends, then history cannot truly be history. If history's function is to elicit in us positive emotions, then it follows that in order to achieve that primary function, history needs to exclude aspects of the past that cannot elicit such emotions. By placing history in the service of myth-making, the real function of history, the unflinching and critical examination of the past in all its detail, wherever those investigations might go, in a matter that is disinterested in how unsettling or discomforting the revelations are, that primary function is rendered secondary. The unprecedented shift in attitudes seen among the young today is not simply in their willingness to confront once marginalized histories, not simply in the fact that it is they who are making demands for changes to school curriculums, for the decolonization of university reading lists. It is not simply that it is they on campuses demanding the universities recognize their direct participation in slavery. What we are seeing is something far deeper, a willingness to recognize that history is not entertainment. It is not recreation. It cannot exist only to comfort us. And it is only after that recognition has been made that history can truly be inclusive and become an engine for restorative and social justice. Because the histories that have been deemed uncomfortable, the histories that have been weeded out, marginalized, ushered to the sidelines, they are the histories that we need in order to understand one another. We cannot know each other unless my history is seen as part of your history rather than as a threat to your history. Thank you very much.
Can I first get you some water? Do you want some water?
Yes, please. Thank you very much.
Now, I must say that working in a public institution, your last points were a little bit jarring. History is not entertainment. History is not recreation. History cannot be history if it is only placed in the service of myth-making. And I want to come back at the end to what you suggest when you say we cannot know each other if we are afraid of each other's history as threat. I want to come back to the end, at the end with that. Thank you for a wonderfully challenging, but also intriguing and exciting lecture. Before I ask any question, though, I want to turn over to the audience to ask your questions. Because one of the things we promised is that we're going to make this a conversation, right? And so I see somebody over there, and I want to ask for the first question. First question.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this very, on one part I say enlightening, and don't take me wrong, comforting. Comforting. Why do I say comforting? For the same reason that withheld us from trying to know each other and to accept each other. We have embarked on a long path, but we are on the right step. We are on the right track. I have been very active in government for a long time, and now I'm at the sideline. And there has always been like a kind of a, what's government's part and politicians' part and the general community and groups within. Can you give us just a little bit more of the change of attitude from both sides? But we have to come together and continue to walk the path together, because we're going to find each other now in this commemorative year, and it's a U-turn. It's not a U-turn. So both government as well as the non-government, we have to find our way to, you fill it up, fill it in.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Forgive me, I'll use British statistics. Obviously, I know the United Kingdom better than any other nation. I think some of what's happening here is enlightened self-interest. The demographics of European nations are changing so incredibly rapidly. It's not just that attitudes are changing, it's that people's encounters are changing. We call young people, we often call them digital natives because they've always had the internet, they've always had cell phones. They're also diversity natives. They've never known a time when the sports, the athletes that they admire, the musicians that they admire, the YouTube influencers who they are glued to, have not been people from all over the world. They've never known a time when it was not normal for Korean pop music to be part of their lives. They've never known a time when their diet didn't include food from all over the world, and their friendship groups were incredibly diverse. They are diversity natives, and they, for reasons I don't think anybody has properly or convincingly pinned down, just seem to have a completely different attitude towards history. They are comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I find it absolutely fascinating when I talk to my students about these issues, and then I think about debates that I have when I go to a television studio, or even worse, when I make the mistake of turning on Twitter. And I see this wave of discomfort, of false equivalence, of resistance. I meet genuinely good people who are, for reasons they can't even themselves explain, defending slave traders or imperial soldiers. This generational shift is absolutely enormous. And the reason I say enlightened self-interest, because I think a lot of people can see where this leads. The demographics of the United Kingdom, again, the country I know best, by one projection, by the middle of this century, the United Kingdom will be about 30% either diverse, non-white, or mixed. If you are any form of institutional corporation or corporational leader, and you don't have a business plan that extends to 2050, if you don't have a mechanism for thinking who are going to be your customers, who are going to be your employers, who's your succession planning, that recognizes that 1 in 3 people are going to be diverse or mixed. And remember, every mixed race family, interracial couple, is 2 extended families. I think it's becoming unusual when I go to people's houses in the United Kingdom and you see that big picture of the family gathering, the wedding, or whatever it is, for everybody in that picture to be of the same race, whether it's an ostensively black family or an extensively white family. Even our royal family, though they don't have many gatherings these days where they all get together, looks like the rest of Britain. Companies, corporations, charities, universities, I think they see this. And it is an enlightened self-interest. Heritage organizations who make their business from history. If your business cannot appeal to 1 in 3 people in just 27 years' time, you have no future. So I think there's enlightened self-interest because it's a very simple question. In which direction is any society likely to move? Towards the attitudes of the old or towards the attitudes of the young? And I think the people I meet in business, the leaders I meet, they've got this. They've worked this out. If that answers your question, madam.
No, before, I just wanted to say thanks. Because for everybody, I didn't say this to her, Maria Liberia Peters, just thank you for all the work that you've already done. So I want to just celebrate that work. And without putting him on the spot, but I think your question already puts him on the spot. I want to thank the Minister, Mr. Decker, for being here, but also ask you to pose the next question. And not on the spot, no pressure.
Well, let me first thank you for this very powerful and uplifting lecture, but also add my thanks to everything that you have personally been doing as a public historian and kind of amend these structural deficiencies in our histories, and that actually, you know, I think is also, you're yourself an example how scholarship and can go hand in hand in addressing these issues. And I know you're inspiring yourself also many young people with your media expositions, and so thank you for that.
Thank you.
You were very kind, so to say, about messages to governments. And you were, I think, very powerful in saying this is a current in our societies that is, you know, almost unstoppable, and we all very much hope irreversible. And we are working towards a situation that any institution, government, educational institution, business, should ask itself these very deep questions about what is your own entanglement with slavery and colonialism. So my question is, you know, what would you advise government? Governments can do things, but often they become very political. What can governments do to kind of stimulate this kind of, you know, stimulate, so to say, top-down, the right bottom-up movement, without, so to say, or being very conscious about hierarchical situation? And because in some sense, you know, I think we truly want the form of the debate to you know, be commensurable with the content, right? It's about fighting these hierarchies, etc. So how can you do that in a way that it's truly inclusive and not rubbing, so to say, institutions the wrong way? Yeah. And perhaps a little addition to it, it's some way in which we can learn more from what's happening in other countries, because you have quite a global perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank
you.
you. To take the second part first, I think one of the most important things we can do is recognize that this is a phenomenon that's spreading across the world. One of the most remarkable things about 2020 is if you look at the map, and there are websites that show this, of where statues were removed or toppled. Many more were removed than were toppled. It is a global phenomenon. People saw in the terrible murder of George Floyd and in the movement that followed a sense of empowerment that linked them to their own feelings about history. There were movements and marches and campaigning in Australia and New Zealand among the Dalit community in India. It wasn't just linked to people who were the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. So that recognition that this is a global phenomenon. What I often find in Britain is that people will presume that they are being singled out. Because that insularity of not looking at other countries, when these debates happen, people think, well, you're attacking Britain. If they knew what was happening in France or the Netherlands or in Belgium or in Germany with the Herero and Nama genocide, they would see it was a much more global phenomena. But it is, the irony I have is when I wrote my first book, which was about the German genocide in Namibia, I was accused in Germany of being a British guy attacking Germany out of a sense of kind of xenophobia. When I write about British Empire, I'm told as someone who hates Britain and I should be picking on Germany. So there is a kind of no-win situation here. Recognizing that this is a global phenomenon, I think, can help us one of the ways of escaping a sense of victimhood. Recognizing that this is a conversation, a debate whose time has come, I think is a healthy and realistic approach, because given the underlying demographics. I think when it comes to government, there are two things. I think firstly, it's what government shouldn't be doing. And I think you're in a much healthier situation in this country than sadly in my homeland, because you have a much more healthy press. The worst thing is not what governments do, it's what they do. It's what they do when they try to use these debates to create false divisions. The false dichotomy that you must choose between worrying about social class and social mobility and worrying about the legacy of racism and slavery. That is a false choice which is presented as a real binary constantly in nations that are trapped in culture wars. When politicians can avoid doing that, when politicians can resist the potential for electoral triangulations that might benefit from doing that, I think that is a hugely important thing. I think it comes down to education. We were actually discussing this earlier before the conversation. This is a moment that the conversation repeatedly comes down to education. We have had a history that was hidden for centuries. We are dealing with a phenomena in structural racism and racial hierarchies, a concept of inferiority and superiority, a network of stereotypes that took centuries to build. Vast amounts of energy, ingenuity, effort, creativity, institutional power were poured into generating the ideas that still infect our societies. The idea that we're going to withdraw this poison in a couple of years or a couple of decades, I'm afraid is wishful thinking. It's astonishing when you look at the archival record of just how much was produced to inculcate these ideas into societies, how much effort, how much money it took, how these ideas were not just in books and academic papers, but in popular culture. It's going to take generational work. Something that was built on that scale with that level of effort over that number of years will take a commensurate and comparable amount of effort to deconstruct it. And at the heart of it has got to be harnessing what we've already got for reasons no one understands. We've got a generation who care and who get it and who are willing to be uncomfortable with history, giving them more information, giving them more power. And knowledge, of course, is power. To me, that's the most fundamental thing that politicians can be doing. However, having said that, the people who also should be doing it are people like myself. It took me many years to work out that my responsibility as a public historian was also to write children's books. And to my great embarrassment, it took parents, black parents in England, coming up to me and in some ways ordering me to write children's books for me to do that. So for me to criticize politicians for not changing curricula, not demanding an expansion, for me to be critical, as I try never to do, of teachers themselves, some of the responsibility is people who generate history, who produce knowledge, need to make sure that that knowledge goes to those young minds who are more fertile to it than anybody else.
All right. I'm watching.
So I'm
the
not
clock.
known for short
no,
answers.
No,
I'm
that's all
sorry.
right. That's all right.
Not one of my strengths.
I am also not known for short answers. 1 second. I want to just get a question from the public, from the digital public, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. So on the digital public, there is an ongoing anxiety actually within public discourse around questions of polarization.
Yeah.
And so this person is asking, you ask for a new understanding of history, but how can we move forward in that direction while not becoming increasingly polarized?
I think it's to reject the terms that the culture war are fought on. I'm half English, Scottish, working class, and half Nigerian. And I'm constantly told that by caring and wanting to write about race, that I'm somehow not caring about half my family. I'm constantly told on social media that I hate white people when I'm obviously demonstrably mixed race. We need to not accept and not engage with these culture war arguments on their own terms. We need to demolish them, deconstruct them, because they are fundamentally about creating that polarization. One of the things about a culture war argument that's always really useful to remember is what they accuse you of is what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They're doing the polarization. They're building the division.
All right. I see a question right here, and 2 questions.
I've read your books, I've watched your programs, and it's really great to hear you speak. Thank you very much for the talk tonight.
Thank you.
I'm a British citizen, British-Irish citizen. I've lived here 23 years. And I just want to share information about what I see as educational apartheid, and then ask a question. In Britain, you get educational apartheid with private schools and comprehensive schools. I went to a comprehensive school, went to Cambridge, found it a totally different world, very elitist. In the Netherlands, I live in the southeast. It's called the Zuidoost, mainly people from Ghana, Suriname. And I think until recently, there was no school that offered Greek or Latin. No, I can't remember if it's a lyceum or... it's no kind of grammar school that would enable students from that area to train to be doctors, dentists, professionals. It's only recently. And I wondered why weren't the grammar schools built there in the southeast, and the children from the city centre go out there? Why did the children from the southeast have to go into the city centre? So I'm really pleased that some change has happened. But my question is, maybe like in America, and I think in places like New Zealand and Australia, universities, when you hear somebody speak, they will always acknowledge the original dwellers or owners of the land, a particular tribe. I just wonder whether with buildings in Europe, we could acknowledge the people who, the people who are enslaved as part of the kind of people who built that building in a way. So people's names, and often I know the names of the people who were enslaved were the names of the owners, but whether that's one way to start embedding the history of imperialism in the buildings that and when we speak about in the buildings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I often worry about names and how important they are, because I just don't think they work. I think names just become things that we say, and they become places that we know, and the histories behind them get lost. I mean, again, this is a British example. Forgive me, I spend most of my time in Britain. When people talk about street names, I always ask them, in London, you might know there's a famous Portobello market. In Edinburgh, there's a part of the city called Portobello. I have yet to meet someone in Britain who can tell me when the Battle of Portobello was and who Britain was fighting. One of the most common street names in Britain is Alma. Alma Road, Alma Crescent, Alma Street, thousands of them. The reason for that is because it was a battle in the Crimean War, and the Crimean War took place at the same time as a building boom, the development of suburbs in Britain. I lived on Alma Road, and I'm a professional historian, and I never bothered looking up what it was called. It was actually when my partner was helping me research a book that I went, oh yeah, idiot, of course. I think names just float into the background. I have a much bigger issue with statues. And I think I'd much rather we left names unless they are enormously egregious, and there are many examples, like streets named after genocidal German generals who committed genocide in Namibia. I think for the most part, they merge into the background. Statues are very different. Statues are a form of validation. And statues say our society validates and values what this human being did. And sometimes our ancestors validated and recognized people who did terrible things because they made mistakes like we made mistakes.
Thank you. A quick question, and I'm going to do 2 questions very quickly so that we can push it on. Yeah, go ahead.
I have 3 questions, please.
No, you have one question. One question. Yes, one.
We are back to an age of rationing.
Some 15 years ago,
Yeah.
there was a discussion about, and I was glad that Mr. Vian named it, mentioned it also, about victimization. I want to ask you, how could we deal with it?
Yeah.
How do you have it? And another question, please.
I'll just say that first question.
Indentured labor, how you can compare that about slavery?
The comparison. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, David.
The victimhood narrative, I think there's 2 things to say about it. One is I think it exists, but it's exaggerated, because it's exaggerated as another way of saying here's another thing that's wrong with black people. What I keep hearing is, it used to be acceptable to say black people were incapable of advancing because of innate physical, racial failings. Now I'm told that black people aren't getting anywhere because of a sense of victimhood. And I've been in debates with black people with every degree you could dream of, every qualification, who are millionaires, who've had people tell them that they are walking around the world with a sense of victimhood. I think it's real, but it's exaggerated. I think, again, this is a failing of my profession, of historians. If we've written histories in which we have not got across that anyone who went through the experience of slavery and enslavement and the slave trade was anything other than an astonishing human being to get out of it. If you are descended from enslaved people, your ancestors survived slavery. The idea that they are victims to survive that. No human grouping has ever gone through slavery without resistance. There was resistance at every stage of slavery, from wholesale wars in Africa to battles about the slave fortresses, and the fact that there are fortresses on the coast of Africa proves the extent of the resistance, to a huge number, an unknowable but a huge number of uprisings, everything from small-scale attacks to takeovers of slave ships. There was resistance and rebellion throughout the slave system, dozens and dozens of them in the British and the American context, and of course the Great Haitian Revolution. So this idea that has been propagated, that enslavement is a form of victimhood, I fear this has been a failure of my profession. And historians have got a lot to do to redress that balance, because I think we very probably, very evidently got it wrong.
Can I ask you, forgive me, we need to go to the next question. So, Munir, your question.
Okay, I'll keep it as brief as possible. So I just returned from Zanzibar, and there I visited a big exhibition on the East African slave trade. And it lasted there till the 1920s, bringing up a lot of pictures. So finally you have dozens and dozens of pictures of the slavery, which was so atrocious to see that I can still not speak about it, really. But what I was wondering, while we were always so much focusing on the route on the sea, ocean, and South America and North America, don't we underestimate the hundreds and thousands of people that were enslaved on the African continent or died and never made it? Because we, in fact, only focus on those that survived, but so many never did. And I think the numbers are much higher than we are even aware of. When I was looking into that exhibition, that is one sub-question. I'm so sorry, Wayne. In the exhibition, in the exhibition, you saw the massive role that Arabs, Turkish people, Germans, and so on and so forth played. And here in the Netherlands, the focus is pretty much black and white. Black is the victim, white is the perpetrator. But when you look into those exhibitions, you find that we are all really entangled to our core in this slave trade. And what is your perspective on that? Thank you.
Thank you.
All
I think
right.
one of the reasons why the slavery in the Indian Ocean and also the trans-Saharan slave trade, the 3 African slave trades, are under-discussed in Europe is because all of it's under-discussed. We are generally disinterested in the histories of other people. One of the great failings of academic historians when it comes to slavery is to interconnect the study of the North Atlantic slave trade that the Netherlands and Britain were involved in, and the South Atlantic slave trade that was dominated by Brazil. most people in Britain know slavery ended in the 1830s. Most people in the Netherlands know it ended in the 1860s. Very few people of us know that slavery continued in Brazil until 1888. So I think part of it is just our own self-obsession. We're not interested in the Islamic world, in India and Turkey, as much as we are in Europe. But I think there's another element there too, which is we just are struggling to even come to terms with the stuff that we've got to take responsibility for. And what I worry about is when conversations reach for the trans-Saharan and the Indian Ocean slave trade, it is normally as a way to avoid talking about the Atlantic slave trade. So almost always when someone says, but what about the so-called Arab slave trade, it's a device to say, it happened there, therefore it's not just Britain, not just Europe, therefore it's not worthy of discussion. So I am actually, I think 5 years late producing a book on the Indian Ocean slave trade, as my publishers I'm sure have remembered. So it is something that I think there's a huge amount of scholarship about. Ron Siegel's great books 20 years ago, but there's a lack of interest. It's much, much easier to persuade a publisher to write a book about the Atlantic slave trade, or even more so, slavery in the United States, than it is to talk about what happened in Zanzibar or Pemba or anywhere up that coast.
All right. There is a young person here in the audience that I want to give the voice to.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I wanted to ask a question about solidarity among the people in the African diaspora, because right now we're talking about transatlantic slave trade, and we're talking about the descendants of enslaved Africans. But not every person of African descent has a history of slavery within their family. But especially in a country like the Netherlands, where so many different people from African backgrounds live together, even though it might be evident to some, I think it's important to explicitly ask the question, why is this history of the transatlantic slave trade important and relevant for all African people, and not only for those who have a history of slavery in their family?
I'll be brief. I think there's two reasons. One is that the greatest strength black people have had and their allies have had is unity. The other is the most fundamental reason, is that even if your family was from Central Africa, even if, and this is in many ways unlikely, there's no connection between centuries of slave trading and your ancestors, that the slave traders and their agents somehow never reached the villages which your ancestors lived in, which I think is unlikely. Even if that were the case, every person of African descent in the world today is affected by a set of ideas and stereotypes that the laboratory of which were the plantation islands of the Caribbean and North America. The ideas, the theories, the stereotypes, the arguments that were used to justify the colonization of Africa, that was used to justify the dehumanization of all black people. The laboratory for those ideas were places like Barbados, places like Virginia, places like Aruba and Curacao, dare I say, like Haiti. So this idea that this is something which happened only to the people who were on those islands. And again, it speaks to the gentleman's point. Whole African societies were devastated. There are wars that most of us could never name that were fought over decades against slave traders. Societies were torn apart. Ethnic groups were almost decimated. Every person of African descent is affected by slavery and its legacy.
All right, I want to take the last two questions very quickly. And if you're going to have a long question, then please don't ask. Sorry. So, yes, please.
Getting strict
very,
now.
very short question as a question.
Thank you. My name is Ivan Levin, and my African name is Nana Kwakujata. Thank you for the lecture you gave us today. I have a problem, and when I have a problem, the government has a problem. Because I want to ask you to be very critical to the government of the Netherlands, because we have a big problem here. And the government must take the lead. First of all, the media. The media is putting things on the news and on the television where black people, African people are always in a negative way. We need to, someone must tell the media, and I think it must be the government, to tell them to stop with that. Because we are poisoning the community, saying black is evil, white is good. That's what I want to ask you, to give us some information, especially to the government, to take care of that, because we see what is happening and because of the media. And the last thing, the people in Holland, when we are talking, they don't want us to be critical. When you are critical, they put you out of the sight. And we need to have the space to be very critical, especially to the government. And the government is right here now. Please give them information how to deal with this, because it's a very big problem. The media is poisoning the community. Thank you.
All right, before you answer, David, can I just get the last question at the same time, and please shorter. And my intention is not to put you aside, but it is just to keep within our time.
Thank you. David, hello.
Hi there.
Thank you for the presentation, inspiring as always. My question is very succinct, and it's about the differences between the UK and the Netherlands in terms of dealing with the question of restorative justice. So in the Netherlands, as you mentioned, the government is taking the lead. In the UK, institutions are. Do you see any kind of benefits about one of these approaches? That's it.
Thank you. Well, in some ways, there's a commonality between those two questions. I'm very much in favor of leaders leading. I think it would be a very good thing. I think, sadly, one of the things that you'd have to say about the United Kingdom over recent years is our leaders have not been the place to look for leadership. So I'm enormously in favour of governments taking the lead on this. I don't think that the process that's taking place within institutions is mutually incompatible with there being leadership from government. And I think it's going to take government as well as institutions to produce some sort of blueprint. As I said in my presentation, restorative justice is a science that we're making up as we're doing it. There is no blueprint. There is no plan to pull off the shelf. We don't know how to do this yet. We're trying to invent it as we go. So we absolutely need government to be involved. So I would much rather that the UK government was making similar commitments as the Dutch government is. I know there's lots of criticism and lots of debate about those commitments and how far they go or whether they go far enough. In terms of the media, sir, I spent my entire life working in the media. I have no doubt, I have first-hand experience of the racism within the media, that organizations, institutions that are inward-looking, that are selective, self-selective, that are very often very different in terms of their diversity than the background society, can perpetuate and regurgitate stereotypes in a way that is damaging and to an extent that many people in those industries aren't even aware of. The key to me would be diversity within the media industry. It's something I spent much of my career fighting for in the United Kingdom, and I think it sounds like something that the Netherlands needs to invest in as much as the United Kingdom, if that answers your question.
You know, if I were to have asked a question, I would ask the question about what is the role of public institutions in acknowledgements, in apology, in actually doing what you suggest as regards learning from each other's history in an attempt to know each other. If I were to ask a question, it would have been, what do we do with the exhaustion? That exhaustion that is at this moment from institutions, but from all of those activists that have been fighting forever to try and make change and not see change. If I were to have asked a question, I would have asked a question about public history, different from the history in university, and what is the difference. But I'm not allowed to ask a question because we are now at the end. And therefore, I leave this, and in relation to the gentleman who I did not get your name, I leave this as a public invitation that this is the beginning of a conversation, an ongoing and unfinished conversation. And perhaps we might invite David next time to sit with us in a less big audience where we can discuss this. But we together, the Tropenmuseum, NINSE, would like to invite you to continue this conversation because, taking your words, David, we believe that history is a tool for helping us to create that world that we want in the future. David, we want to thank you. Please join us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Shall I go on?
Yes, please. And And I might make a mistake, so I'm going to ask Milal to tell me that if I invite everybody to drinks and I shouldn't, then tell me no. I'm allowed to invite you all to drinks. Thank you all for being here. Until next time.